Right, it is 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, 1 p.m. Eastern. And I want to just honor all of your time today. So I am going to get us started and allow people to continue to join. Good morning. My name is Michelle Okere, and I am the Executive Director of the Indigenous Prosperity Foundation. I'm also a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta with deep roots in the Red River Settlement in Manitoba, as well as the Fort Belknap Indian Reserve in Montana. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important discussion as we launch the summary report, the Digital Access for Entrepreneurs report that we've done over the last several months. This session will be recorded and will be available and redistributed following the presentation. The presentation will take approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and we will leave some time at the end for questions and answers. I welcome you to share your questions in the chat feature, and we will come back around to those at the end of the presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Edmonton, Alberta, on the traditional territories of the Cree, Dene, Stoney, Saulteaux, and Blackfoot nations, as well as the Métis homelands and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. I also recognize that our audience comes from many Indigenous lands across Canada. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the lands in which you occupy, which have been stewarded by Indigenous peoples for time immemorial. The knowledge, tradition, and stewardship continue to guide us, and I'm grateful to be working towards solutions that empower Indigenous entrepreneurs today and well into the future. Today, we'll be sharing key findings from our research on digital access, the barriers that Indigenous entrepreneurs face, and the solutions that can create real change. This report is a call to action for policymakers, funders, industry leaders, and for all of us to ensure that Indigenous businesses have the digital tools and resources that they need to survive. Before we dive into the findings, I do want to take a moment to thank the many Indigenous entrepreneurs, industry experts, and partners who have contributed to this research. Your insights, lived experiences, and expertise have shaped this report. Your leadership and vision are driving real, meaningful change, and I sincerely appreciate your willingness to share your knowledge and perspectives with all of us. This research reflects a collective effort, a shared commitment to ensuring that Indigenous entrepreneurs have equitable access to the digital tools and opportunities that they need to succeed. So for those who might not be familiar with the Indigenous Prosperity Foundation, I wanted to share a little bit about us before we got started. We are a registered charitable organization that was founded by NACA, the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, working alongside Indigenous financial institutions across Canada. Our mission is clear. We strive to create an inclusive Canadian economy where every Indigenous entrepreneur has the support that they need to succeed. We focus in 4 key areas, which you can see across the bottom of the screen. First, it's training and mentorship. We offer business, digital, and financial training. Next is an internet and technology, bridging the digital divide through high-speed internet hubs and access to digital tools. Then seed capital and grants, supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs with funding and financing opportunities. And then finally, capacity building, strengthening Indigenous-led economic solutions for long-term prosperity. This report is directly aligned with our mission by identifying barriers, accessing existing supports, and outlining solutions. We're taking another step towards economic reconciliation and digital equity. Now, the purpose of the research was to explore digital access, the landscape of digital access for Indigenous entrepreneurs, and provide real, actionable recommendations. Our research aimed to identify the main barriers Indigenous entrepreneurs face in accessing digital tools, to assess the existing programs and resources and determine their effectiveness, to highlight key gaps in infrastructure, funding, and training, and to provide solutions that can lead to digital inclusion and business growth. By understanding these challenges, we can work towards real solutions that empower Indigenous entrepreneurs, ensuring that they have not been left behind in the increasingly digital economy. Now, I'm going to ask you to bear with me while I take a sip of water because I've been speaking all morning. Thank you. So you might be curious about our methodology. To ensure that we had a comprehensive, data-driven understanding of digital access challenges, we used a multi-method approach. This included 4 key areas. The first was a literature review. So we examined existing research on digital equity and Indigenous entrepreneurship. Then we did stakeholder interviews, speaking with 18 Indigenous entrepreneurs and digital access experts across the ecosystem. Next, we did a survey, so gathering insights from 111 Indigenous entrepreneurs on their experiences with digital tools and the barriers that they also ran into. And then last, ecosystem mapping, evaluating the current programs and supports that are currently available. This research approach allowed us to capture the lived experiences of Indigenous entrepreneurs while also understanding the broader ecosystem and the challenges and supports that exist there. So today we're proud to launch the summary report alongside additional summaries from each phase of our research. This will include the interview summary, which has key insights from Indigenous entrepreneurs and experts that we spoke with, the literature review summary, a deeper dive into existing research on digital equity, and then finally the survey summary. So this will break down the data that was collected from Indigenous entrepreneurs. We know that different audiences may find different sections relevant to their work. By providing all of the summaries, we aim to make this research accessible, practical, and actionable for those who want to continue to support Indigenous businesses in the digital space. So first, as many of you know, it's hard to miss in the news these days. Canada is at an economic crossroads. With shifting trade policies, labor shortages, and declining productivity, we need to ask, where will our next wave of economic growth come from? One of the strongest answers is Indigenous entrepreneurs. Indigenous businesses contribute $30 billion annually to the Canadian economy and are among the fastest growing sector in the country. One thing is clear from our finding: digital access is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Over 80% of Indigenous entrepreneurs say that digital access is critical to their success. 85% use digital tools to expand their markets, improve efficiencies, and engage with customers. However, despite this reliance on digital tools, significant barriers continue to exist. Digital access barriers limit business growth, job creation, and economic self-determination. On this page, you'll notice that we have many quotes from Indigenous entrepreneurs that we connected with. They face real challenges every single day. Some of the things they said include, I know I need to invest in digital tools to grow my business, but every time I calculate the costs between software, website hosting, and internet, it just becomes too overwhelming. Another said, I've spent months getting bounced around between agencies without any real support. And we've heard this again and again as we've done our Walk Together tour across Canada. Next, we heard living in Northern Canada can barely hold a Zoom meeting without losing connection. And others talked about, understanding the values of this and the way that it needs to be incorporated into their operations, but just continuing to run into challenges. So we're going to get into some of the very real challenges in the digital space. And we have some great insights and data to back this up. Our research identified 4 key areas where Indigenous entrepreneurs face the greatest challenges in digital access, as well as the unique challenges that are faced by women and youth, a core component of the groups that we look to serve. In this section, we're going to provide a high-level overview of these challenges. So first, one of the biggest roadblocks for Indigenous entrepreneurs is the cost of digital adoption. 88% of Indigenous entrepreneurs struggle with affording internet, software, and digital tools. Many funding programs require upfront investment or complex applications, making them inaccessible for small business owners. And ongoing digital maintenance and cybersecurity costs remain unaffordable for many. As an entrepreneur we spoke with shared, I know I need to invest in digital tools to grow my business. And again, every time I calculate the costs, it just becomes overwhelming. Without affordable funding models, Indigenous entrepreneurs are at a disadvantage. Addressing affordability is a real key part to unlocking digital access. Next, a lack of reliable, high-speed internet remains a major challenge for Indigenous businesses. 65% of Indigenous entrepreneurs say that internet costs are too high for them to operate efficiently. 17% report unreliable broadband, making virtual meetings, online sales, and cloud-based business tools difficult to use. And as someone who's worked extensively in Northern Alberta and the territories, I can say this is a real challenge. And lastly, Indigenous-owned broadband solutions remain underfunded. So it limits the access of high-speed internet in rural and remote communities. One entrepreneur told us, our business's most urgent need right now is internet connection. Without it, we can't operate efficiently. Investing in Indigenous-led broadband solutions can help to address this gap and ensure that every Indigenous entrepreneur has reliable internet access. Next, I want to talk about the digital skills and training gap. Even when Indigenous entrepreneurs can access digital tools, many lack the training needed to use them effectively. 57% of Indigenous entrepreneurs say that they don't have access to structured digital training. Many existing programs are not culturally relevant, reducing overall engagement in the Indigenous community. And a lack of mentorship makes digital adoption even harder, especially for those who don't have strong digital backgrounds. One entrepreneur told us traditional digital skills training lacks integration with Indigenous knowledge, making it less relevant or engaging to Indigenous learners. Creating culturally relevant, hands-on training opportunities can help Indigenous entrepreneurs fully embrace digital transformation. Next, systemic barriers and institutional mistrust. Beyond infrastructure and training, many Indigenous entrepreneurs face systemic challenges that make digital adoption difficult. Many refer to the referral loops we talked about at the beginning, being passed between programs without receiving any real support. Short-term funding models make it difficult to sustain long-term digital growth. I'm sure we've all experienced that. We can get a little bit of a pot of money here, but there's no kind of long-term support through fully integrating that into our systems. And there's mistrust of institutions, including government and financial programs, which prevent many entrepreneurs from engaging with available resources. An entrepreneur shared, there are programs available, but they don't talk to each other. I've spent months getting bounced around between agencies without getting any real support. To close the digital divide, we must be coordinated and have long-term support for Indigenous entrepreneurs that they can actually rely on. And that's something that we've really been looking at as an organization. Next, I want to talk about some of the unique barriers for Indigenous women and youth, which came out very clearly in the research. Women and youth face additional barriers when it comes to digital access. 91% of Indigenous women entrepreneurs cite financial constraints as their biggest challenge. Many Indigenous women entrepreneurs also report experiencing online harassment, which discourages them from fully engaging in digital business spaces. And then lastly, 65% of Indigenous youth say that they were introduced to digital tools too late, limiting their ability to develop critical digital skills early in their careers. One woman entrepreneur that we spoke with shared that, I rely on social media for sales, but constant harassment makes it exhausting. We need to have safe spaces in order to operate and be able to thrive in our businesses. To create equal opportunities, we need to target support for Indigenous women and youth, from funding to mentorship to safer digital spaces. So that's a lot of information that I just shared with you. It's not, one simple tool that can fix all of this. So I want to talk a little bit about the key takeaways here. Without immediate action, these barriers will continue to limit business growth, job creation, and economic self-determination for Indigenous entrepreneurs. It's not something that we can afford to let happen. When Indigenous businesses thrive, so do our economies, and right now we need that more than ever. The good news is we already know what needs to be done. Through this research, Indigenous entrepreneurs, experts, and community leaders have outlined a clear, actionable path forward. And so I want to walk you through that now. So we have identified 6 key pathways for action, Indigenous-led solutions that can break down these barriers and ensure digital access is not just available, but it's affordable, reliable, and culturally relevant. So let's dive into these in a little bit more detail. First, one of the most pressing challenges that we're facing right now is limited internet access, particularly in rural and remote communities. But we know the solution. It's investing in Indigenous-led broadband expansion projects to ensure reliable, community-owned internet services. Actionable steps include supporting Indigenous-owned broadband companies to provide high-speed internet and subsidizing internet costs and developing affordable data plans for Indigenous businesses. This approach can shift control of economic benefits to Indigenous communities, ensuring long-term sustainable digital sustainability. As Fawn Rice from ICTC put it, direct investment in Indigenous-owned broadband companies creates long-term solutions to digital access issues, shifting control and economic benefit to the communities themselves. Investing in Indigenous connectivity solutions is the first step forward to closing the digital divide. Next, I think it's important to highlight the need for improvement in funding access and affordability. Even when digital tools are available, many Indigenous entrepreneurs simply can't afford them. 88% of Indigenous entrepreneurs struggle with the high cost of internet, software, and digital tools. The solution? Expanding Indigenous-led funding programs to make digital adoption more affordable. Actionable steps might include things like increasing microloans and grants for digital business needs, strengthening Indigenous-owned financial institutions and culturally relevant financing, and simplifying the funding applications to reduce some of the bureaucratic barriers. And as somebody who has been an Indigenous entrepreneur myself, I know accessing funding has been a real challenge. Sometimes these applications are lengthy. You're already so busy in the day-to-day operations of your own business that the idea of taking hours to pull together all of these documents to apply for funding that you may not get simply doesn't appeal to you. So I know for me, there were many times that while funding might have been available, I opted not to go after it because it just didn't make good business sense for me. By improving funding access and affordability, we can ensure that Indigenous entrepreneurs can invest in the digital tools that they need to grow. Next, access to digital tools alone really isn't enough. Entrepreneurs also need training to use them effectively. 57% of Indigenous entrepreneurs lack structured, culturally relevant digital training. The solution? We need to develop Indigenous-led digital training programs that integrate traditional knowledge and values. Some actionable steps that we've identified include creating community-based digital education programs that reflect Indigenous ways of learning, providing sector-specific training in e-commerce, AI, cybersecurity, and automation, and offering flexible learning options, things like virtual, in-person, and hybrid options to ensure that we're meeting people where they're at. By ensuring that digital education is accessible, engaging, and relevant, we empower Indigenous entrepreneurs to fully participate in the digital economy. And I think this one's really important to highlight, though it's not an easy fix. We really do need systemic change to ensure Indigenous entrepreneurs are not just participants in the digital economy, but leaders and decision makers in it. Some key actions that we've identified in this area include ensuring Indigenous representation in digital policymaking and funding allocation, advocating for Indigenous-led governance models in broadband expansion and technological regulations, streamlining program eligibility and funding processes to reduce inefficiencies, and then creating a centralized Indigenous-led digital hub to consolidate funding, training, and mentorship opportunities. By strengthening Indigenous governance and policymaking, we ensure that digital solutions are designed by Indigenous communities for Indigenous communities. Indigenous entrepreneurs also need safe, secure, and sustainable digital solutions. We can do this by supporting Indigenous-led cybersecurity initiatives that protect business data, and data sovereignty is a big conversation right now. We need to develop long-term broadband sustainability models to maintain infrastructure. And we also need to increase awareness and training on digital security to improve online safety. Without cybersecurity protections and sustainable digital access, Indigenous businesses remain vulnerable. Investing in digital sovereignty and long-term security is the key to a thriving Indigenous economy. So lastly, we talked about this a little bit earlier, how there are quite unique challenges that are faced by Indigenous women and youth. And so we must address these head on. 91% of Indigenous women entrepreneurs struggle with financial barriers, and many face online harassment. 65% of Indigenous youth said that they were too late being introduced to digital tools, limiting their opportunities. So how do we address that? We can expand targeted funding and micro loans for Indigenous women and youth, develop mentorship programs that address their specific challenges. We can strengthen protections against online harassment to create safer digital spaces, and we can introduce digital skills training earlier in education so youth gain exposure sooner. Supporting women and youth entrepreneurs is essential to building the next generation of Indigenous business leaders. So the call to action. We're at a pivotal moment. We need to invest in Indigenous-led infrastructure and training, and we must ensure that digital access is equitable, sustainable, and empowering. The findings in this report show that Indigenous entrepreneurs are ready to grow, innovate, and lead. But without immediate action, digital barriers will continue to limit their opportunities and growth. So my call to action is this: for governments, funders, and businesses, and for all of us to support Indigenous-led solutions. If you'd like to read the full report, I've given you some snippets here today. You can access it at indigenousfoundation.ca/digital. And if you want to collaborate on solutions, you can reach out to us. All of our information is on the website, and we would love to connect with all of you. Together, we have the opportunity to bridge the digital divide and ensure that every Indigenous entrepreneur has the tools that they need to thrive.